even though it was very hastily, and I'm sorry for the limited time, but we still wanted to kind of have this out and started discussions about it, is on the ways we work in being active or passive in collecting, the methodologies that we use, are there committees, and what kind of authority lies with those committees. Those are some of the things that were mentioned. The ways we cope with the logistics, the infrastructure, the lack of budgets, the mergers taking place, and which are actually, on the one hand, being very limiting. On the other hand, they at times invite us to start rethinking, reframing the ways we work. What should we collect? Well, what Stockholm was also in the same that I guess the museum also had to think of. Okay, we've come out of certain histories. We all have our local histories. We all have our histories of the museum, which are actually both in the collections, but also in the histories of politics, which have to do with why we are being merged and why we are being brought from Paris to Marseille and then have to reinvent our position in the city that we're located in. Other topics of ethics and also the ways that we conceive our futures, I guess, and what is it that we want to have in our collections represented of these times? How should they be represented, and are we allowed to represent them in our collections if other museums are delegated that presence of being able to work with migrants and being able to work with communities that are living around your museum? So those kind of aspects, I think, are really important for us to keep on reflecting on and see how we can rethink and reframe them within very strategic or at times, what I understand from Denise, I don't know if more organically appearing processes which have to do very much with the research which is going on also in the topics that we want to choose, that we want to work on, and then maybe at a certain point of time they will certainly reflect certain strategies even though we didn't define them from the start for the next 5 to 10 years. So I guess there's many different ways that we're working, but at the same time I assume that maybe Lotten will give us some insights on the stuff that you heard from this, which might kind of wrap this up together.
I think since today we have touched both on the complexities of institutional everyday lives with the mergers, with the funding, with the icebergs of acquisition histories, disciplinary boundaries, the agency of the archives and the taxonomies working through our hands, and also the hopes for new relations, possibilities of new technologies, and urge for new narratives and perspectives that we seem to share. And the idea now is actually that I will divide this. Some of the time was eaten by our eagerness to discuss acquisition complexities and to talk with one another over coffee. But I will allow, before we move on to the panel, and we will discuss some of the issues that are now at the table. Where do we move forward on this issue of co-collecting and self-representation? I wanted first to ask a few questions to the partners in SWICH. Just thoughts on what revelations and thoughts have you had during these days? Because I'm sure all of us will bring back a lot of ideas and impulses to start working. Can I ask with you, Chris Wingfield from Cambridge? I think this is on.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting couple of days, and I think thinking about collecting and co-collecting, and when is collecting not co-collecting, and when is co-collecting the same as collecting, have kind of been interesting and productive, and it's clear that we're sort of struggling to find our ways towards certain kinds of things. It's interesting that the thing that I kept thinking about actually throughout the last couple of days is actually taking me back to thinking about 10 years ago when I was a curator at Birmingham Museum, and we had a project that came together looking at kind of the roots of reggae and of music, and it was connecting the West Midlands, the West Indies and West Africa, and it came out of a community project. It was kind of had a lot of kind of youth involvement. It came out of a sense of local kind of Caribbean communities in Birmingham about what was important to them, and it came to the museum and said, this has been so successful, it's been great, we need to put it into the permanent gallery, and we need to put it into the anthropology galleries. And that was the point where I became involved and said, okay, well, what have we got? And we've got this 19th century collection of West African drums, and we've got lots of kind of contemporary things from the West Midlands. And I said, well, what have we got from the West Indies? And I said, well, we've got suitcases, because, grandparents came from the West Midlands, from the West Indies, and we had these suitcases. And that was a problem where I suddenly felt, this is actually a real problem. We can't represent a part of the world and the musical heritage of the Caribbean with suitcases. And I think we kind of at that point got in touch with Wayne when he was in Jamaica, and in terms of the co-collecting, it was very much a project that kind of emerged out of that kind of expertise, Wayne's. And I went to Jamaica for 10 days and basically went where Wayne told me to go, and spoke to the people that he told us to go to, and paid the amount of money that he told us was the right amount of money to make this collection. And that was a kind of really interesting kind of moment in thinking about co-collecting, because it came out of a need. It came out of a need to engage with, particular local communities who wanted to explore an aspect of their heritage, but actually the museum didn't have the resources and the collections to do that. And I think it was, it was a co-collection with the local community, but it also became a co-collection with the Institute of Jamaica and Wayne's expertise, and the kind of, in order to kind of fill that need. And I think that kind of lots of different forms of collaboration that came out. And I wondered really what kind of Wayne, reflecting on that process, thinking about it now as someone working in European museums, I mean, how does that kind of work? Because obviously there are kind of problematic dimensions to that, but it was kind of the thing that I've been sort of mulling through and trying to reflect on over the last couple of days.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think it is a good thought to keep in mind that, I mean, who needs whom? The museums have enormous things to gain as for enriching collections and deepening knowledge production. Also a voice from Vienna, Claudia Augustat, please.
Yeah, well, I would summarize my thoughts coming up in the last 2 days, maybe under the headline, The Power of Collections, because I sometimes think that the collection is also forming and influencing the curator. And when you're looking at the policies of the museum from today, you see that now the curator is starting to forming and influence more the collection. And I think that this is a very interesting relationship we maybe can go deeper in. But you see that we are still talking on strategies and on categories like art or ethnographic objects, yeah? And so I wonder, when we see the examples from the co-collecting, where people bringing objects to the museum we never thought about could be in our museum, that co-collecting can be a chance to challenge our categories we are working with, yeah? And so maybe this co-collecting can start a transformation from the fundament of the museum, from the collection, or in the case of Vienna, really from the basement. And this is maybe, for me, one of the big plus of co-collecting.
So it can start as a desire to complete an idea of the museum experiencing its own urge, its own limitations, and then the co-collecting processes will actually work as catalysts, also starting to change and question the fundamentals in interesting ways. Yes, these are actually so crucial processes to create change. I also asked Michael Mohammed from Marseille and Museum to comment, and he said, I'm not a curator. And then I said, but isn't it interesting that now we need experts on international relations? Curators used to think that they were the only sort of networking people needed, maybe, but maybe not. Sorry, I'll hand it over.
So once again, I'm not a curator.
What does that mean? Think about that.
Well, the thing about, I really like our colleague from Manitoba. You start your presentation thinking that co-collecting was about meeting. And I really like that. And basically, in our museum, we have no community strategy. This thing that we mentioned on the first day, thanks to Wayne's question. Basically, the museum is supposed to present or represent ourselves rather than the other. So, because we work on the Mediterranean and Europe, it's already us. Which then the question is a bit different. And our friend, I think this is, you, who said that in co-collecting processes, we needed a voice or someone to talk to. So the question is, always, who is a good voice to talk with? So I give you one example. We're not supposed to have countries' strategy. So we're not going to have a programming about, like, Morocco, for example. Nevertheless, reality have worn us back, and we had a political demand to have an exhibition about steel and bronzes from Morocco. That was, political demand, and we had to do an exhibition about that. And it was so bizarre for us to say, okay, we're going to have an exhibition which is about a country, Morocco, which is going to be represented through Roman heritage, which is very, European-centered. And we, in our new museum, are going to represent Morocco through this approach. I'm not sure we are talking to the good, actor to represent ourselves, us in the Mediterranean. So we had to look for, a balance. So we organized an exhibition about contemporary art, but once again, we had to choose the artist because they were from Morocco and not because they were good. They were good, obviously, but you know what I mean. So that was actually terribly challenging. And the only thing is, after 2.5 years, after 3 years now of museum opening, the only thing that we have is in common, rather answer, is just a line of question. This is the only thing we have in common, and this is the co-questioning that we have and that works. So basically, every time we have tried to elaborate project representing Morocco, for example, and here you see that, it's not very, scientifically proved and appropriate. Every time we have tried that, it was difficult to do. Every time we have tried to raise question that was shared, that was much easier to do. So again, as a non-curator, the co-questioning, and sometimes the questions are not the same, and we haven't talked about the several people we could talk to. There is also, when you talk about Morocco being a French museum, there is a burden of the past. And for example, why, how do you raise the co-question without being in, the previous, dynamic of being forgiven or to forget or, etc. That's remarks.
That adds to the complexities, and I think partially what I'm hearing is the difficulty of opening the stage also for a kind of co-collecting on a as a relation between nations on the level of national politics, which is, it's part of the scene. But I think most of the co-collecting attempts we've been discussing, they have also worked with local communities, even on an individual level. However, there were also examples brought up that reflected on the difficulties, the role of the mediator, and the vulnerability of the museum also sometimes in going from the curator as an interpreter to a mediator, and all these roles, actually this way of working seems to affect the roles on all the levels. It even affects the museum space and also the role of the audience in many ways. So I think we need to start sorting about these things, and to me the role of the mediator is actually crucial to understand in a way. Do we need mediators? How do we get beyond mediators? How dependent are museums on mediating expertise? And what about just plain the kind of encounters that make us more human to each other? What was it Joe Horsecapture said earlier on? When in doubt about these processes, hug more. So, I mean, you can't hug the Moroccans. I will actually now give the word, and I hope that we will see what time allows, but I will now give the word to the people who were kind enough to step up here. Maureen a little even without being warned ahead, but she did it. There was a hot chair. And you recognize again our keynote speakers, Sean Mallon, from Te Papa in New Zealand, and you have Joe Horsecapture from the Museum of the American Indian. And we have Leah Abayao, who works as an expert in residence at the moment at the Linden-Museum in Stuttgart, doing digitized repatriation with the collections, and having being a scholar of traditions and also traditional expert at once. And also, again, we'll hear Maureen Matthews, and we also have the host of this event, Wayne Modest, because he's so good at phrasing things in interesting ways and bringing thoughts together, we hope. Actually, I think some of the issues that have been brought up today have demonstrated that we can turn different paths. I mean, we can go to our historic collections and look for co-collecting. We can make new acquisitions, in a way, in the historic collections, thinking of the way in which many of these acquisitions actually reflect very conscious diplomatic gift donation, very active self-presentations in the past. Or we can also take another step and work in the contemporary. And it's, of course, amazing with all the possibilities of the technologies. It's where the post-colonial meets the post-secular. New spaces are created, new protocols. What are the possibilities? What are the challenges? What do you want us to work more on? And whatever you want to share with us. I think I'll start from here to the left and just have a comment from each to kick us off.
Well, just reflecting on your comments just there, I think when we reflect on the history of our collecting and our acquisitions, if we read against the grain of the catalogue, to borrow a term from other areas of scholarship, if we read against the grain of the catalogue, we can start to see Pacific or Indigenous peoples that we work with as active agents in their relationships with the museums. Like, we tend to think the hole that's easy to fall into, the position that is easy to fall into, is to just see the museums as the all-powerful collecting institution that vacuums up everything that's out there, that throws out the scoop net and brings everything into it, and that people are passive. But when we actually read against the grain of the archive or the catalogue, we can start to see and think about the ways in which the transactions through the objects tell us about the people who own them, who carried them, who gifted them, who sold them. And I think there's many different histories to read into that. And that was the sort of revelation to me when I was thinking about my presentation, was just seeing, no, where did co-collecting pop up in my short history in the museum? And going forward, I think that for me, picking up on the conversations this last 2 days, hearing some of the heartbreak stories, I think co-collecting might just have to be a targeted strategy amongst all the other curatorial strategies we have at our disposal, and one that we deploy according to the circumstances, the history of relationships, and the problems that come up before us as curators and institutions. So my ideas aren't fixed, but I'm thinking that a targeted approach to co-collecting based on projects that are manageable and resourceable, might be the way forward for me personally.
Yes.
So last night actually I was thinking about this. I was thinking about co-collecting. I'm still trying to exactly figure out what that means, to be honest. And then I was thinking about the conversation we had about gifts and gifting. And I was thinking about my own background. I was thinking about other background from different people from different parts of the world. And many traditional cultures that I know of, gifting and exchanging gifts is critically important. And it creates these great relationships. So somebody gives something to you, you give something back. So then as I sort of take a step back and I think about our world, our museum world, whether it's NMAI or whether it's Ethnographic Museum, for many, many years we've been receiving these gifts, whether these gifts were given in a good way or whether they were taken, we're still receiving them. So in order for us as museum people to continue this relationship, we need to figure out, what are we going to give back? What are we going to give back to the communities where these things came from? It's not all a matter of take. In order to develop a healthy relationship, we need to figure out what we're going to give back.
Okay. For me, my reflections has been on one aspect of Joe's lecture yesterday, and it has something to do with the end goal of that exhibit that they did on that one exhibit that they made. And one of the questions that struck me a lot was, we did this well, and it was not much appreciated. And I was reflecting a lot on that, because as I work with the Linden-Museum, that was the thing that kept me hanging. And it's something that I always problematize, because much of the collection, for instance, has something to do with head taking. Okay, so all the spears and the axes are there. And I know very well the history part, the historical part of the collection, in which the Philippines, for instance, was projected as head takers in world fairs. And that's the history of the collection we're working with. One of the collection we're working with at the Linden-Museum are objects which were taken from the Philippines during the Louisiana World Fair in 1904. It was used in the US, and one of the organizers of the exhibition brought the objects in exchange for a badge. That's the military badge from the founder of the museum. So that kind of history, that history part. And the reason why I'm reflecting on this has something to do with what is a reflection on the relevance of museums, not just to communities or the culture bearers in which these objects came from, but also how do you mediate this to people who would come and look at either the virtual exhibition or exhibitions that are physically made. So you struggle in between, how are you going to produce an exhibition, whether it's virtual or not, and not being ahistorical in the way you present all this. Because on the one hand, you'd like to show, for instance, an aspect of the community, because I know in working with communities, there are also priorities. There's this strong selective way of wanting their histories to be remembered. That's why they edit out the generational memory. For instance, there are histories, there are past histories that they would not want to remember, and there are reasons for that. How do you bridge that with something that interests a special audience about the past? That's something that I think about. And one of the things that helped me a lot was discussing this out in communities. So for instance, communities would say, oh, head taking, that's the past thing in our life. We don't do that anymore. We're Christians, we don't do this. It's something we don't want to remember. But in the process of discussion, for instance, with communities, they saw the relevance of head taking in relation to rituals that survive nowadays. And so that kind of presentation of how head taking may have stopped and was part of their historical past have survived in particular memories nowadays in a positive way, in something that they would still remember and make relevance in contemporary times, is something that we're trying to explore, and something that's still in discussion with Gyok at the Linden-Museum. So thank you.
That's really interesting.
So I'm fascinated by these reflections, because I imagine all of these interactions, the collecting and the relations with the objects, as being very interpersonal. And yet, our city was recently accused of being the most racist city in Canada in a national magazine. It was really pretty shocking. And our mayor, who has Native ancestry, organized a photograph with himself and judges, doctors, lawyers, all Native people, standing up and saying, yes, we know it's racist. We're working on it. What are the rest of you doing? And it's a context in which our museum and my collection become extremely political, so that the personal relationships that I have become politicized. And I say to everybody who talks about the city of Winnipeg as a racist place, that it's not racism, it's ignorance. And that actually our museum is a public education institution. If you want to know more, walk across the street. We're here. And these collections have taken on this really new urgency. So the first exhibit I did was about treaties. I have pipes in there that are a kind of person and had to have a party before they could be exhibited. There's nothing traditional about a pipe being in a museum, and the contribution of Aboriginal ceremonial people to working out a ceremony that would be right for the pipes as 150-year-old objects of sacred objects, and the museum with its contemporary political problem was really, really crucial, but it's how things get worked out. And I was telling my colleague here, the second largest minority group in Winnipeg is Filipinos. Tagalog is the second most spoken language in Winnipeg, in spite of the fact that we're a bilingual French and English city. And my colleague, who is the curator of archaeology, who is First Nations, is married to a Filipino woman. So like, the racism which is described for the city of Winnipeg is because we actually are connected. And I feel that the objects have a mediating role and the museum has a mediating role. So I think that when you think about co-collecting, it's this idea that in fact people are being engaged from many different perspectives with the same objects. And it's the relevance of the object ultimately that creates the future co-collecting experiences. But collecting isn't the thing, it's the relationship that is formed both by bringing things in and by exhibiting them. Here.
Well, then we can move it back. So no, I learned a lot. I think that and I kind of have a few notes here. One of the things, just to start out, when I think about just what Claudia said just now, I was in a conversation recently with a historian who wrote Provincializing Europe, and we were talking about minor histories and what are minor histories. And his idea, which I think is beautiful, and I wanted to tie what Claudia said with what Sean said, is that perhaps what these bringing-ins do, when you bring in collection, is that they actually are that bringing in as minor histories destabilize the major histories. It is there to try and trouble what we've come to know over time, what we've come to know as a particular kind of collecting vein. So if each object, each collecting moment is an instance in writing a minor history, then what we are seeing is that this major canonical history that we've come to know is being destabilized by each moment of bringing in, which perhaps is not necessarily, I'm still not sure if that is co-collecting, but I still think that it is urgent. It is important to note those. And I like the way Sean spoke about it, where he says reading against the grain to try and see the ways in which those transactions brings voice to the people who've always been in a way kind of voiceless. But we can also go back to more theoretically to that moment, writing cultures in anthropology, but also Fabian's work earlier in terms of time and the other, where we were speaking about the questions of co-presence and what does it mean to be co-present. And so within the kind of anthropological, it was about ethnography and writing and that writing, but one could also think of that co-presence in the framework of the earlier collecting, that there are all these people who are giving things at the moment in a kind of co-representation of what is going to be written about them in the future. So in a way, that is an active contribution to a kind of thinking contemporaneity. I was here at the time that the collector was here. And in a way, that there is a way in which co-presence, I think, could be an issue. One of the things, though, I struggle with, and this is my own struggle, I have two struggles in this entire conversation. The idea of co-collecting, how we formulated this in this workshop, in this project, is supposed to do something. it is a political act to think about what does it mean to collaborate and co-collect. So if we can read everything that we've done in the past as co-collecting, then what I would ask is political in that. Are we not just extending the same things that we used to do because it makes, namely, going to hit myself against the head as well. And I can say, like you, Michael, I'm not a curator, but I can't do that. I can't even say that. But aren't we just extending what we used to do anyway? So what is the politics? And if I were to use the phrase that, just drawing on what Michael said, and let us ask this question. If you say that, if I were to take the model of museum and I would translate it here, and I would say that, which is what our museums does, the National Museum of World Cultures is about representing us. It's not only about representing them, it is representing us. So then one could ask the question, who is the us that is representing us? If the us that is representing us is the same us that used to represent us 55 years ago, then what is the us in that? And does that mean that it's a reconstitution of who is being represented and who can represent? So that is a political question that I would like to ask, because it is about the politics of who represent whom. How has that changed? And what does it mean to co-collect in that change? And this comes to my last good point, and I thank Joe Horst-Capture for this, when he speaks about the question of giving. Because giving, in some theorization, is something that should, and Hyde speaks about this in the 78 book, is something that should always continue. And once it continues, it always has an obligation. So what is the obligation that we have to the people who give? And if it is that Native North Americans, Maori, people who we can accept today are, in some instances, have suffered from the colonial past, then what is our obligation to them in the present? Because giving, always, giving is always a burden. So what is the burden of reciprocity in giving if we conceive of co-collecting as part of a gift exchange relationship? So I would be interested to also think that we can reconceptualize the earlier trajectories of co-collecting, of collecting as co-collecting. But as we contend with our museums in the present, in their afterlives, then we have to see what is the political struggle, what is the politics of representation that they are part of. And my last difficult point is, thank you, Chris, because one of the things that I am frightened to do is to tell you that as a Jamaican, I can represent Jamaica. I'm totally always terrified to say that. Because every time I move from Jamaica is a very class-based society, yeah? Really class-based. So I move from my uptown intellectual citizen position, and I want to go downtown, and I study downtown, and I realize that there's a difference there. So what does it mean that I'm implicated in a practice that is representing somebody called the Jamaican? I'm not saying that this shouldn't happen. I'm not saying that I cannot represent it better. I'm not saying that. But I think that we should ask the question. And if we are not going to ask any Dutch person to represent Dutchness of the street, to represent Dutchness, what does that mean? And I can tell you that this statement is not to give us throw our hands up in the air and say, okay, Wayne said it and therefore whatever. No, I'm asking a serious question. How do we complicate the notion of representing selves? And what does it mean to represent selves? And I will give the mic over, as I say, Maureen. It was Ian? Yes, Ian said he brought in digital printing, yeah? 3D printing. And one of the things it got me to think is that if we do digital repatriation through photography, would it be as easy for us to do 3D printing and give people back 3D printed objects? And if that doesn't work, why does photography work? Just one question.
Okay.
I stop there.
I actually have an answer, because our museum, what we have, this archaeologist I mentioned, is involved with a project which has been caused by the flooding of a large system of lakes for hydro. And as the banks wash away, old Aboriginal burials are revealed. And whenever one is revealed, Kevin is called. He raises up there. They do an archaeological excavation which involves Kevin supervising a local crew, because this has been going on for 20 years. For a year, the museum has the bones and all of the grave goods at the museum, and while we have it, beautiful, perfect reproductions in plastic are made. 2 sets. 1 set stays at the museum, 1 set goes to the school, and the bones go back in the ground. Everything. So actually, our museum is content with a plastic replica, not even just the community. And so there's a place for replicas, 3D replicas. I work on a project with a group of artists who do 3D photography. And actually those, what are they called? Those things where you put them on your face and you are in a different environment. And we're trying to work out the agency of objects within an artificial environment and testing them. These new technologies are very, very powerful. I would still argue that there's, the thing you have to watch out for with digital anything is that what we're accepting is a kind of a set of parameters, so that for those of you who are familiar with Turing test, the idea is that a computer will be the equivalent of a human when you can't tell on your keyboard whether you are communicating with a person or a machine. And it's kind of like a party trick. You accept that humanity can be conveyed through a computer terminal. And if you saw the computer and you saw the person, you would not be confused. You would know which is which. You just lack information. You lack the exposure to the material object that's communicating with you. So we just have to be careful that we don't confuse the digital representation of something with reality. And it's a peril in this day and age. That woman, Catherine Hales, that I mentioned, looks at people who are very engaged in gaming. And one of the girls said to her, "Reality is not my best window." And that is terrible, but it may be true. And so I think that that's where the museums lie. It's kind of like a physical grounding of experience. And so long as it is a site of human interaction, that's what happens because of the collections, that people are brought together, it really remains important. So I was mentioning those pipes, and I worked with, we always collaborate on our exhibits. So it's not just co-collection, it's collaboration and co-representation constantly. And my partner, who is a Cree fellow from the PA Manitoba, who is the treaty commissioner on this treaty exhibit, he and I have done all the media in Winnipeg, and we've got to the point where we can finish each other's sentences, but he always says, "I like her exhibit fine, our exhibit, I like it really well, but I love the process." That's when he and I were in this gymnasium and then on a reserve, and the pipes, these pipes that were 150 years old were being smoked for the first time again. You know, it was just, even now I get hair standing up on my neck because it was so fabulous, and that's what matters, and those objects made it happen.
For me, I'd like to see the digital part or the virtual part of exhibitions or virtual projects of museums as a way of giving back. Giving back in the sense that it helps in efforts by communities, whether this is diaspora or communities at the national level. It helps in efforts to transmit the knowledge, and this is something that's for the Philippines, it's something that we need a lot, especially that the education system is changing a lot, and there are efforts at the community level in which they would like a stronger collaboration of transmission of knowledge, and museums play a lot when you digitize information that can be of use to communities for projects as such. The second thing that I'd like to say is that the digitization and the virtual exhibition can also bring more problems in the sense that it can open up or it can be used by the wrong person, such as collectors who would sell items, for instance, on eBay or other virtual social media. There are a lot of objects, of course, specific collections that are they're being sold by collectors up to now. So those are my thoughts.
I guess for me, when I think about giving back, I think about it sort of at two levels. Number one, which I mentioned the other day, is we need to create training programs for Native people. So the next generation of curatorial types have more Native people within that group. So it provides an opportunity, if we're talking about self-representation, it provides an opportunity for people from their own community to be in a position of power within the museum to tell the story that is from their community. To me, it seems really basic. We need to find more opportunities for Native people and training for Native people. I'm a firm believer that I think museums with large Native American collections need to develop a fellowship program where they bring Native American people in and they train them to be museum professionals. Number two is digitization of Native American objects. It would be, if I had the Joe Horse Capture Magic Wand for Native America, I'd like to see every community have a digital database of every object their ancestors created. And these objects are somewhere over the world. Because like, for example, my community where my people are from, it's north central Montana, it's called Fort Belknap, B-E-L-K-N-A-P. It's named after President Grant's Secretary of War, who was later impeached for embezzlement. So they named a reservation after him. And there's only 3,000 of us. I think half live on the reservation, the other half they don't. If you go up there with digital pictures or whatever, however you want to look at them, either through a laptop or iPad or whatever, and you start showing the community what the objects our ancestors created, traditional patterns, those kind of things, they don't know what it looks like. So you have a disconnect of well over 100 years that you have a group of people who want to make traditional stuff, want to make dancing outfits, pow outfits, whatever the case may be, but they are the ground of artistic productions that their ancestors created. They can't stand on it anymore because it's gone. And the easy way to fix that is to provide information to the community, so it's in their schools, it's in their tribal libraries, because otherwise it's just a one-way relationship. In 1903, for example, Clark Whistler took, hundreds of objects from that's probably the last big collecting from our community. Half of it's in Berlin, half of it's in American Museum of Natural History. There's virtually nothing left there anymore. Nobody knows what it looks like. So I think part of that gifting back that I mentioned is part of it is training, and part of it is trying to help rebuild the community from recovery from the colonial experience.
You're just reflecting on the gifting and giving and receiving. I mean, part of what interested me about the co-collecting theme of this symposium was the opportunity to reflect on our practice and to strategize about how you could move this area of activity forward. But it was also an opportunity to be reflexive about the politics of co-collecting. Just to riff a little bit on what Wayne was saying. I mean, why do we want to co-collect? Who's it for? How are we placed in that? How are we positioned in that transaction? I think that's an important question. And the thing of what can we give back? Well, if I'm being reflexive, I want to know what the people we collaborate with are taking, not what we're giving them, because that's sort of like a reciprocation. It's a power thing. It's an obligation. But what are they actually taking that we don't even see? The reactions of the Brazilian group to their whole experience in Europe, that was interesting for me yesterday. They took something that wasn't apparent at first, even though there were a lot of problems with their project. But what are people taking? And for me, the co-collecting questions allow us to be reflexive about our processes, but also our position and our roles as curators and people who are often facilitating, mediating these activities. So yeah, and I mean, I'm not going on about agency here when I'm talking about taking, but I think a lot more goes on in our communities than we even know about. You talked about icebergs.
Yes.
We see the tip of these icebergs when we talk to them on the street or or on the phone, or we see them in their communities when we revisit them, but what are they talking about when we're not there? You know, I think that's just as important.
Well, these are exciting times, I think. I mean, many of us have browsed the archives and found these, the advice given to collectors in the field around year 1900, and how there's all this talk of how you have to work speedy because everything is disappearing, and you have to save it, and it will have a safe haven in the museums, but it will also be put safely out of circulation in a way, for then modernity will come rolling. And sometimes some of these advice are just mad, like, ask people, don't allow them to trick you into getting whatever recently produced material, try to get into the backstage, do crossfire interviews. I mean, there's something about the whole sort of feverish attitude of that of that idea, the dream of the systematic scrambling up remains of what's disappearing. It would just be so fantastic to have that time machine and say, listen, there's somebody knocking on the door who really wants to look at the things in order to let it out in circulation, build on it in a new creativity, and also add some more stuff, because things didn't stop. There was never, continuity was always there. And that's, of course, very, very hopeful and also problematic, because it makes you realize this, the profound things that have been taken also, actually. I'm thinking also how much we talk about the digitalization as one context for this whole thing going on today. We mentioned also how the audiences that maybe are not stakeholders in the same way, but how people are so used to sharing their self-representations in diverse social media, how the museums can become sites for a kind of analog sharing. It just seems the natural continuation to start telling the small stories of your life, the self-representations in the exhibition space. I can even imagine that there will be situations where there's competition, because so many people want to sort of use the exhibition space to just to present themselves as a kind of send button. And of course, as for the problematics, as a curator, I think the idea of open access comes more easily than the idea of showing respect to traditions that ask for restricted access, because that's really one of the great conflict. I think it was Kavita Singh who said, well, this whole European Enlightenment inherited, it's another ethnic peculiarity that we have to think of. And the idea of sort of providing access, it's like we've gotten so used to it as being one of the remaining legitimizations of our work. And when that feels threatened, I think that's one of the moments that become difficult. Also the idea of generations. I mean, does it seem natural to discuss these things with elders? Or does it seem natural to talk to the young? And of course, I think the ideal would be to do both. But there is a risk maybe of reinventing a kind of idea of the untouched tradition. The culture is something that safeguards its boundaries and remains static, instead of allowing change and to see that there are many different positions in all communities. I don't know, just to bring in some of the difficulties as well. Do you have any comments?
I just think our training as anthropologists or as cultural producers or museum professionals allow us to negotiate some of those boundaries or facilitate on behalf of people. And surely that's where some of our role is protected as curatorial people. You know, otherwise everyone would be a curator. You know, there's certain skill sets. So we need to be able to help people negotiate those boundaries and those relationships and have the overview and bring our toolboxes, as you know, I've talked about the last day or two, that whether it's anthropology or history, bring them to the task. And that's why the curatorial role, we shouldn't feel threatened by collaboration, but rather think about how we can recast our role a little bit.
It's funny you say that, because one of the things I think I was talking in the corridor with somebody yesterday about is one of the things that we do is that we think of our role as curators as a kind of, or some people think of us anyway, as a kind of fixed expertise, you know, that it is this expertise that is close. We are experts and they're expert, whatever. And one of the things that I think our training does is that it allows us not necessarily the possibility to know everything. It allows us the methods and techniques to know how to get to what you want to get to. And so it allows us that technique to mediate, to be able to pull things together, to be able to study different things and come up with an understanding. And in that mediation role is also working with different groups of people. So it is not that I am the curator over here who stands up and I know every single thing about Africa because I am the African curator. No, I have a set of tools which I can mobilize to be able to put together a research project, an exhibition, whatever. And that I think is an important thing for us to think about how we collaborate as well, which is about empathy, humility, listening, and understanding how we can, together with others, in processes, work through an end that is good for both of us. I must admit, Joe Horsecapture, that your idea is great about this, just this idea that we should offer give people the tools to be able to do it, you know, and whether or not as museums that is a part of we have this thing in Dutch, talentontwikkeling, talent development, you know, but through internships, through programs, whether or not that is a part of what it is that we are supposed to do as well. But I would still like to bring in this, and one of my colleagues yesterday said, this other side that is out there that we've probably missed out on, and I think that's where you're getting at as well, Lotte, because we've also been talking about the community. And the community that we've been talking about is undifferentiated, very big, this kind of thing. And one of the things that we've been working on, me and Dan van Dartel, who is somewhere in the audience or not, oh, she just went outside, is working with a group of people from Suriname, and Daniela was here yesterday. Yeah. And it is a group that is average age, I would say 58, and the oldest person was 80. And we were in a conversation with things, you know, just and I was thinking, what would happen if I had young people here? Because the conversation was about independence, Suriname, 1975, and what objects we have. And it was a really intense conversation with everybody having different opinions, but coming together. And then I was thinking, what if I were to have younger generation people here who actually weren't born in 1975? And what would that have done? It's very often some of our curators get young people who want to actually go back to a past because they want to go back to this pristine past as well, from, you know, where things were undifferentiated and changed, and there was this particular ethnic group. And do we also want that, you know, as curatorial in terms of collaboration with communities? So I think that for me it is a minefield that we enter into. But I think some of the things that we've heard just now, actually at this forum, but over the last couple of days, still gives me the feeling that collaboration, co-collecting, co-representation as processes can do something to help our work, to push our work forward. But how we have to do it is that we have to acknowledge that there's a politics to it. And if we don't, then we're just going to extend in happy celebration of ourselves that we're just doing the same things over and over, I think. Which is not what our museums are doing, eh? But,
I completely agree with you. And one of the ways in which co-collecting pays off for us is that our museum is shifting from a museum that is about Manitoba to a museum which serves the needs of Manitobans, and First Nations people are starting to think about it that way. So over the past 30 years, my predecessor and I have been working on relations with individual communities. But I was just talking to Joe about whether he has lots of repatriation requests, and apparently they still do, but we have, I don't have the human remains side of things, so I don't know about that, but in my last little while, the traffic has been entirely in the other direction. And it's people bringing me sacred materials that they're worried about, that they need a safe place for. We're like the bank for sacred stuff. We have a capacity to do that. We have an elder who can look after it. And if they're really worried, and if you know, they bring it to me, and I am really delighted with that. So our collection isn't exactly collection. It's like suddenly we are the safe place for their things. And I'm missing tomorrow the arrival of the collection that was acquired by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked at the residential schools and abuse. And 3 whole shelves of material are going to be added to my sacred storage area that were the result of this traumatic experience and this traumatic hearings. And I'm so grateful that they think of us in that way. It's a huge responsibility, but again, it's the kind of, like, they'll never be on exhibit. This is not even about exhibiting. It's about, they actually trust us to do that, and that sense of it will generate more utility to the Native community. And even if that's all that happens, it would be good. But in representation, it allows us to say things like, just basic stuff, back to the treaties. You know, why do we have treaties? Because First Nations people were here first. You know, there's no, just the basic ideas that they wish to have front and center. So I just wonder if Joe had any comment about that.
I don't think I do.
There's somebody in the audience. Yolande Padilla from Museum.
I want to say that the question of training, the question of expertise are very interesting to go deeper. When in such an area we have in the Mediterranean, where heritage is not the support that in Europe, we have to find the way to work with people who are involved in heritage, because they don't dispose, they don't have the same training, the same resources, and so on. So we try to do it. For example, we have to enlarge our collection with Mediterranean objects. And in Morocco, we spoke about Morocco tout à l'heure. There is 3 projects of museum which didn't come from the Ministère de la Culture, but from human rights. And they want to develop step by step contribution of population and until colloque to think what to develop. And we are linked to work together, Museum and this perspective of developing heritage. And we managed to training for heritage, and we try to, in Marseille, and we try to associate professional or young professional from the museum in the Mediterranean area. And I think, and another example perhaps is that we have 3 weeks ago, a week in Morocco, gathering curators, artists, and researchers, French and Moroccan. At the beginning, a step, but we were together working on migration and object of migration. And I think, as Wayne said, we have to experiment, to propose such meeting, to learn to collect together, to learn to do co-collecting. That's what I want to say. We have to propose, to suggest space to experiment it and to progress, to go forward, en avant.
Yeah, and that's actually what the SWICH project allows us to do, to have this sort of area for reflection and exploration. So,
what I feel is not to be entre nous. Yes.
No, moving further.
Yes, to make experiment with other people outside professional of heritage, And the point of view upon experts is very important. Who are the experts? And I hope in the shared workshop, shared authority, we think about it, because we hope to invite a philosopher which is working of John Dewey theory. Exactly this thing, who is an expert and why, and how to do things, experimenting it, not only those who know how to do it and those who contribute.
We have one more comment from...
I'm thinking on this topic from Joe to provide the training, yeah? And for example, in our museum, our curator for Indonesia is from Indonesia. She was trained in Europe University in Germany, yeah. So you can say she was one of these natives trained here. And now, after 30 years, she's not accepted as an indigenous curator in our museum. She's a German curator, yeah, in her identity. So when
Who doesn't accept her? We want to know. I mean, would it be the community?
I don't want to
No, I don't want names.
To say all secrets. Yeah. No. Sometimes it's a way. Sometimes even myself. Sometimes I forget that she's an indigenous curator, and sometimes she sees things totally different. Yeah. And also and she's explaining things different, because she has another cultural background, yeah, and so, but we forget to understand this, and so I think we need training where we can bring the worlds also together, yeah, not a training of, and I think that maybe you yourself a good example. You are not thinking like not like a European curator, yeah. And this is very important. Yeah, I think we don't need indigenous curators who are trained to be like us. Yeah, that's for me, it's not so interesting. The other point is the Musée de Quai Branly, they gave, I think 2 years ago, the first time a research stipendia to a researcher from French Guyana, to a Vaiana Apalai. And this was a great possibility for him, but now he's back in his village, and he has not the possibility to use this, what he learned. And he's very frustrated, and he has now a big problem with alcohol, yeah, because he needs now another, sometimes it's difficult. What is the right time to give the training? What kind of training? And these are just 2 examples. I have no answer, no solution, but just to think about how difficult it could be.
I'd like to respond to that.
I'll give this.
Because I think it's an interesting framework to think in. Just one thing about replicas. In 1965, in Jamaica, they tried to develop a Taino museum. And there are 2 beautiful Taino sculptures that are now in the British Museum. They were brought there in 1897. And for the museum, the British Museum gave them a chalk, plaster cast sculptures of the Taino sculptures, and the British Museum kept them. And if you look at the British Museum catalogue, it moves away from, it used to say Jamaica, and then sometimes it kind of says Caribbean, and then sometimes you don't know where they are from. But in a way, and in 1994, when Jamaica wanted to borrow them, the response was, you don't have the expertise, you don't have the training, you don't have all of those things. So in a way, those relationships of power still remains. I am not so sure. Even if people want me to be, I was educated fully in Jamaica. I've lived many places in the world, and people would want me to be an indigenous curator, which I am not. I was trained squarely and hardly in a British colonial education, which made me read a lot more about Shakespeare than about Caribbean literature. And it is the way I was trained. In that regard, it is, however, true that once, and I can say that my colleagues will tell you this, that it is true that once I'm here, my gaze is different, not because I am Jamaican only, but because I think differently about questions of power, blackness, issues of representation, the inequalities that are embedded in those representation, and therefore I ask different questions about those things. That actually is just me engaging with the fact that I was trained in a Western framework, but my training was about questions of materiality and power relations. I would not want my curatorial colleagues to displace me all the time to being Jamaican, because I will know more. I do know more about that, but to be honest with you, namely, forgive me, my colleagues who are here, I know a lot about a lot of other things European that you don't know either. So it is a way that in a way, we are, as part of our cultural biographies and subjectivities, learned and experts and have expertise, both academic and emotional expertise, that need to be acknowledged. But if your curator, I would suggest, has been trained here and living here 30 years and feels herself also European, then it is her right to do that. That is, for me, that's where we have to think differently about expertise.
This brings us back to citizenship.
And yes, it does, which is what we're supposed to be talking about. Because I can tell you that one of the groups that I have worked with, two groups in Jamaica that I think is fundamentally amazing, Maroons and Rastafari. And one of the interesting things, they did an exhibition in the Smithsonian on Rastafari, and I can tell you, that was one of the most difficult exhibitions they could have ever done, because in terms of people who one would say, many of whom are not educated in any traditional way, they have read more, know more about history of violence, know more about history of power relations, and when the curator came to do their exhibition, they were like, yeah, come, tell us something that we don't know. Expertise, it is another form of expertise. And the question then is, how do we see those things in the negotiation, the constant relational practice of creating something together, which I like where individual subjectivities are at play, but we don't also box people in. Because I think that it is very dangerous for a museum like ours that has been participant in what I call a governance practice of what people should be this because we say they are this. It is difficult for us, or dangerous for us, to not allow a curator, an expert, to be expert both in their own as well as in other things. I think it is necessary.
Wow, so there we are working on sharing authority. And there's different kinds of authorities, traditional authorities and curatorial traditional authorities. And there's always power structures, of course. And how do we use the wonderful toolboxes that these provide us with? You know, safeguarding things, displaying things, ordering things, seeing things, analyzing things. And yet without reinforcing those different master narratives that keep relations in place. So that's one of the great challenges. Please give us final words on this, because I promised to finish by 4.
To tell a room full of anthropologists that culture is not a zero-sum game. and that people's experience is tremendously varied, and the histories of our objects are equally tremendously varied. And so when you talk about being an expert, I mean, I think I know a little bit about some things. I don't think of myself as an expert. I think of myself as a mediator, as a person who gets this person in touch with that person and puts this object beside that object and comes up with a story for the day, some kind of connecting narrative. But again, it's all connections. And I don't know, maybe it's because I haven't been at it long enough, that I have no feeling of needing to protect my expert status. It's just not an issue. And the fact that I've hung out with Native people for 2/3 of my life, you can't see that on my face. But you also would never guess from my treaty commissioner friend that he was a Navy SEAL. He comes from Paul, Manitoba. Those things that are secrets that are unknowable to us about other people and other objects, it's a function of that kind of personhood I was talking about. And when we treat other people or objects or these situations knowing we don't know everything. We are in a lot better position than if we think we know. By the way, I have we used to have an internship program at our museum, but I'm a department of one person, and it was gone before I left. So what I've done is I have scholarships, and students who are studying something at the university can do a reading course with me, and the idea is that whatever their question is, there's an object that can answer the question. So I have 2 native scholars a year doing this, and it's our way of dealing with that. But absolutely, I totally agree with Joe on the question of the integration of Native people into museums. But I also worked in the media, and we had a parade of First Nations interns, and they came and they got trained, and then the next person came and got trained. But until the institution is prepared to accept the qualifications and the equality of that person in a job, it doesn't work. You have to be prepared to offer people a job, or the internship is a sham. So be careful about that. People don't want to be used, and they know it. And you know, the last thing is just that the key thing is respectful relationships throughout.
That's a good one. Oh. I'm going to allow final words for the 3 of you, if you like. He spat it all out.
Yeah, I'm a product of an institution that put in place a number of strategies to manage diversity in our country and to decolonize itself and to bring different voices to the conversation. And my training in anthropology and history was, you know, my efforts, I guess, to try and equip myself to engage with critical conversations about the people of my background, the Irish and the Samoans, but also about other people who had shared similar experiences to me. So what it quite means to be an Indigenous museum worker when my parents are settlers in a country that was settled initially by Māori is a question that still turns in my mind all the time. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, I really believe that we need to hire more Indigenous people in museums. That's a part of a way of connecting with diverse groups of people. But I find it hard to draw firm lines, or I'd find it hard to write a schema of how you measure the success of that role. But that's what makes these conversations so interesting, and why I guess we are here doing this sort of work. And yeah, those are just unformed reactions to what you guys have just said. But you know, we're part of the machine, I guess. But co-collecting is a strategy about thinking around diversity, decolonizing the institutions we work for. And I think, like I said in my talk, it's about recentering the institutions in a very different way. So making them more relevant for the present day.
Thank you so much. I think this just strengthened even more during these days. I had the feeling that we are in a process where things are changing in ways that makes the reciprocal potential of collections are activated and have to be activated even more. And the role of curatorship is moving towards a mediating role, and more people who step in have these also sort of dual agencies, and in a way it's maybe tricky that the expert role slips away at the same moment as this becomes a mediating role. We should be careful not to be disempowered at the moment when we're about to do some change. Okay, thank you all.